Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Yitzchak Rudomin, and today we are continuing with our series of studying, learning, and reading Breshit, Perek Yud, that's Genesis chapter 13. And before we start, I would like to cover a few general points, what I call him, because we've the matter of studying about the life of Abram, and then we'll continue studying the life of Yitzchak, Abram's son, and studying the life of Jacob and Jacob's sons. And that will be the conclusion of Sefer, the book of Genesis, but we have a way to go, many, many chapters. Because the Torah is dedicating time in Genesis to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, we need to reinforce and understand the status of these three, of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They are called the Avot, the Avos, the forefathers, and as I had mentioned briefly in some other videos, each one is an embodiment of one of the divine attributes. So Abraham is the embodiment of the attribute of Chesed. That's symbolic of God's name, Yud He Vav He. That's written with the Yud, He, and a Vav and a He in Hebrew, and in English they pronounce it Jehovah or Yahweh or W or YH, V or W H. I'm just saying it for educational purposes so people should know what I'm talking about. But it's the Midas Harachamim, God's attribute of justice, that is embodied in Abraham, through Abraham, in the persona of Abraham. And then next comes Yitzchak. Yitzchak is the embodiment and the persona of Din, justice, Midas Hadin. That's another one of God's, that's the other. There's actually two extremes. God's attribute of justice and God's attribute of mercy. Mercy and justice, justice and mercy. Those are the two attributes. Mercy is in the right, justice is in the left. Because like they say, for a normal right-handed person, the right hand extends, the right hand goes out, the right hand is able to accomplish, whereas the left hand is restrictive. It pulls in. You cannot do as much with your left hand as with your right hand. It pulls in. It cuts off. It's a limiting force. It's a limiting organ, limb. So that's the difference between justice, which righteousness, loving kindness, chesed is extensive, whereas justice cuts back. It's din. It's the Hebrew word die, and in fact, even the English word die in Hebrew means enough, stop. And in English, die means to die, to pass away, which means life has stopped. So that's din. That's Yitzchak is din. And then Yaakov is a combination of the two, of Midas Harachamim and Midas Hadin combined. When justice and mercy are working in perfect harmony, what do you get? You get the truth. You get emes. So that's Yaakov. Yaakov is the embodiment of the attribute of truth. There are some other names for this, but these are the names that I was taught and that I go with and that I understand and that makes sense to me. These are based on Kabbalistic principles as well, but this is the basic idea. So remember, Abraham is Midas HaChesed. Abraham is the attribute of mercifulness. Yitzchak is the attribute of din. Isaac is the attribute of justice, of law, justice. And Yaakov is the attribute of emes, of emet, of truth. Jacob is the attribute of truth. Now, once we have the forefathers, so we continue in stages. That's one stage. We have avos. Then we have shvatim. From Jacob will come tribes. The 12 sons of Jacob will become 12 tribes. Actually, there'll be 13 tribes because Joseph's two sons are counted as equal tribes. That's because he eventually gets the rights of the firstborn, and in inheritance laws, the firstborn has a right to a double portion. That's just by virtue of being firstborn, he has a greater status. So Joseph is considered to be the true firstborn of, well, he was the firstborn of Rachel. Jacob had more than one wife. But so Ephraim and Manasseh count as two tribes, so it gives you actually 13 tribes, because Joseph is represented by two. And after the Shvatim, we'll see in the Torah, there is the next stage called Shivim Nefesh, that the tribes multiply and increase to a group of 70 people called Shivim Nefesh. It's a state. Shivim Nefesh Yerda Mitzrayma. As 70 souls, our forefathers descended into Egypt. And after that, in the Torah, you get Shishim Ribui, 600,000 males over the age of 20, plus their families. So it gives you about 2-3 million people. So now, once the Jewish people attain the level of 600,000, that's the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt, were at that level. So since that time and until today, the Jewish nation has never shrunk below 600,000 males of the age of 20 and above. So that's always been a constant throughout Jewish history from the time of the Exodus to our day to day. So that's a definition of the Jewish nation. The minimal number is 600,000 males over the age of 20, and plus their families. So it's always been at least a few million people. Now, because of persecution and because of assimilation, the Jewish people have never been allowed to grow. But had they been allowed to grow from their original numbers, we'd be in the billions and billions of people today. You know, they've done calculations, like, for example, in China and India, only a few hundred years ago, there were maybe, 150 million Indians and maybe 150 million Chinese, but today there are billions. There's more than 2 billion Chinese, there's about 2 billion Indians in the land of India, and that's because they've been allowed to grow naturally, whilst the Jewish people have suffered persecutions and exiles and all kinds of tragedies that have kept them cut off, short, as small as a people, as well as assimilation. The Jewish people have a tendency to want to assimilate into surrounding cultures, so we're always losing people. As we see today in the United States of America, there are about 6 million Jews, but 90% of them are assimilated. And a huge number of that 90% is already married to non-Jews. So their children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren do not seek to marry other Jews. They marry other non-Jewish people, and that's eventually how the numbers of Jews just melts away and shrinks. Okay? So that's it for the levels of the Jewish people. But then I wanted to continue with another set of a continuum of measuring the stages of the Jewish people, stages of life of the Jewish people from biblical times. So in the times of the Bible, we had the Avot, we had the Shvatim. The Avot means the forefathers, Shvatim, the tribes, the Shivim Nefesh, the 70 souls, Shishim Ribu, 600,000 and above. And then during that time, we had leaders. So Abram, Isaac, and Jacob were leaders among the tribes. Judah and Joseph were leaders, and Reuven was a leader. And then when the children of Israel entered the land of Israel, after Moses, they had Joshua. So we entered into Joshua and the judges, Shoftim. We had our leaders were judges. They were called Shoftim. It was the period of the Shoftim, the judges. And after the Shoftim came the Melachim and the Nevi'im. The Melachim and Nevi'im. The kings, a monarchy was established, and we had prophets, because there was also the building of the Beit HaMikdash. So when the Jewish people were in Israel, they had their kings, they had a temple, so they also had prophecy in the land, and they had prophets. And we have the book of prophets that contains the most important prophets and prophecies that were preserved as they affect the future. And after the prophets, after the era of prophecy ends, essentially after the destruction of the first temple, and already during the first exile, the 70-year exile in Babylonia, you have what is known as the era of the Chachamim, of the sages. And there's discussions in Jewish sources, which is greater, Chacham or a Navi? Who is greater, a sage, a wise man, meaning wise in Torah, or a prophet who receives direct communications from God? And I think the conclusion is that a sage is greater because a sage adds from his own wisdom and understanding to the subject matter, whereas a prophet is limited in what message he receives from God. He does not add too much of his own. He can add, he just basically gets the message across. Maybe he can add a little, but not to the extent that a chacham can add. And this then begins the age of rabbis, what we call rabbanim. A rav means a great one, or it means a teacher. And this is the stage that we are still in. But that stage is also broken down. The stages of the chachamim, there are levels, because the earlier generations are greater. So you have, and I'm skipping some. There's more of a breakdown, but I'm skipping some. I'm just mentioning the most important. There are the Tanaim, the scholars of the Mishnah, and that lasted for about 200-300 years, till about the year 200, when the Mishnah was finally written down by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. After the Mishnah comes the Amoraim. They are the scholars of the Gemara, and that era ends roughly in the year 500-600. There are two Gemaras. There was a Gemara that was studied and written down in Babylonia, Babel, Talmud Bavli, becomes the Talmud. The Mishnah and the Gemara becomes the Talmud. And then there's the Talmud Yerushalmi, what's known in English as the Palestinian Talmud. But in Hebrew, it's known as the Jerusalem Talmud, Talmud Yerushalmi. So the Tanaim and Amoraim, the Tanaim are the scholars of the Mishnah. They're greater than the Amoraim, who are the scholars of the Gemara. And together they form the Talmud. It doesn't end there, because continuing, after the Talmud was written down, you have the era of Gaonim, the Gaonet. There were leaders who were known as Gaonim, Gaon, and that era lasted for about 200-300 years. And after the Gaonim, you have the era of what's known as the Rishonim, the early scholars, the early rabbis, early in the sense that they're early than the more current ones, but they're not the earliest rabbis. And the early rabbis are rabbis like Rashi, Rambam, Ramban, Maimonides, Nachmanides, and Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchaki. They are the Rishonim. And following the Rishonim, starting about in the 1500s of our counting, from around the time of the establishment and the sealing of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, which finally codified all the streams of Jewish law from among Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, the Oriental Jews and the European Jews, It was all codified into one book known as the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. Literally, Shulchan Aruch means set table, because everything is prepared for study and for practice and for knowledge and for learning. So those scholars to our times are known as the Achronim, the later scholars. So we've gone through. We have the early stages, and then we have after Moshe Rabbeinu, after Moshe and the Bnei Yisrael, after Moses and the children of Israel, we have Shaftim, judges, and the Nevi'im, the Melachim, the prophets, and the kings, and they existed during the times primarily before and during the first Beit HaMikdash, the first temple. Then you have the era of Chachamim, the sages, Tanaim, scholars of the Mishnah, Amoraim, scholars of the Gemara, Gaonim. Gaonim means great scholars, great ones. And then you have Rishonim, the early scholars, and the Achronim, starting from before, during, and after the times of the second temple, the second Jewish temple. And this is where we're at. We're in the stage of Achronim. The famous rabbis of our days, of our times, are part of the Achronim. Okay? So that sort of sets the stage now that we're talking about Avram Avinu, Avram, our forefather. That's how we refer to the three forefathers. We talk about Avram as being our father. We say Avram Avinu, Yitzchak Avinu, Yaakov Avinu, Abraham our father, literally our, not forefather, literally our father, Abraham our father, Isaac our father, and Jacob our father. So it gets very personal for the Jewish people. Now, as I usually do, we'll read in English Aryeh Kaplan's translation of the Torah. You will find links in the description box below to a text of the Living Torah and the Hebrew English translation. That's another link. And then another link to the Rashi commentary, which I use a lot. So now let's read chapter 13 as an overview and to give us a little bit of an introduction to today's subject matter. Abram, he's still called Abram. He hasn't been officially transformed into Abraham. He's so far still Abram. Abram headed northward to the Negev. Now remember, he's coming out of Egypt. There was a famine in the land of Canaan. He went down to Egypt with his wife Sarai. Sarai was taken captive by Pharaoh. Pharaoh was punished for holding on to Sarai. And then Pharaoh lets Abraham and Sarai leave Egypt. He tells them to leave Egypt and to go back to the land of Canaan. So now Abram is headed northward to the Negev along with his wife and all that was his, including Lot. Lot is his nephew, Abram's nephew. Abram was rich. Abram was very rich with livestock, silver and gold. He continued on his travels from the Negev towards Bethel until he came to the place where he originally had his tent between Bethel and Ai, the site of the altar that he had built there at first. Abram called in God's name. Lot, who accompanied Abram, also had sheep, cattle, and tents. The land could not support them living together. Their wealth was so great that they could not stay together. Friction developed between the herdsmen of Abram's flocks and those of Lot. The Canaanites and Perizzites were then living in the land. Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have friction between me and you, and between my herdsmen and yours. After all, we're brothers. All the land is before you. Why not separate from me? If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If to the right, I will take the left." Lot looked up and saw that the entire Jordan plain all the way to Tsar had plenty of water. This was before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like God's own garden, like the land of Egypt. Lot chose for himself the entire Jordan plain. He headed eastward, and the two separated. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, having migrated as far as Sodom. But the people of Sodom were very wicked, and they sinned against God. After Lot left him, God said to Abram, "Raise your eyes, and from the place where you are now standing, look to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. If a man will be able to count all the grains of dust in the world, then your offspring also will be countable. Rise, walk the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it all to you." Abram moved on. He came and settled in the plains of Mamre in Hebron, and there he built an altar to God. So that's the end of chapter 13, Genesis chapter 13, and there are 18 verses, 18 verses in chapter 13. And now, as we do, let's take a look at the Rashi commentary, and we'll touch on some select Rashis, not all of them, not everything. There are not too many Rashis in this chapter. It's a short chapter, and there are some Rashis I'd like to touch upon, okay? You're familiar with Rashi commentary. Rashi is a rabbi who lived about 1,000 years ago, and his commentary is central to understanding the text of the Torah as well as the Talmud. What he does in his commentary in the Torah is essentially take from the essence of the oral law, the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral Torah, Midrashim, Talmud, other teachings, and then he attaches the essence of the core teachings of the oral law to the written law that we are studying. So you have the written law and the oral law all in one, in concentrated form, with Rashi providing that benefit to us. So now, chapter 13, verse 1. Vayal Avram Mitzrayim hu ve'ishto. Abram arose, he went up from Egypt, he and his wife, v'chol asher lo, and everything that was his, v'lot imah, and Lot is with him, Hanegba. So he went from Egypt to up to the Negev. The Negev is the south of Israel, but it's to the north of Egypt, northeast, right? And this is what Rashi is going to be focusing on. He went Hanegba. So where's Hanegba? Now imagine you're living in, today, we have maps. You can go on the internet. If you're an educated person, you've studied geography, social studies, you should have an idea. If you're Jewish, or certainly if you live in Israel, you know where Israel is, you know where Egypt is. But in the times of Rashi, Jews were living in France, Jews were living in Russia, in Germany, in Spain, in North Africa, in Babylonia, which is today Iraq, in Persia, which is today Iran. Jews were spread out all over, and they didn't necessarily have a good grasp of the geography of Israel and of the world. Rashi lived in the 1100s. Voyages of discovery didn't start yet. They didn't know about the existence of America. Maybe they knew something about the Far East through people who had traveled, but even that was a mystery. So the known world, as they called it, was very limited to that area around the Mediterranean, and even that was very difficult for people to understand because not everybody had a map and not everybody had access to geographic studies. So Rashi comes along and he explains when it says that Avram headed Negba to the Negev, so where's he going? North, south, east, west, which direction? Lava ladaroma shel Eretz Yisrael. So that's the question Rashi is answering, that Avram is going to head towards the south of Israel. Kamosh amar lamaila halach v'naseh negba, as it says above, that Abram traveled to the Negev. Okay, so he's heading to the Negev. Lahar HaMoriah, and he's heading to Har HaMoriah, Mount Moriah, which is the Temple Mount. ומכל מקום שהוא הולך ממצרים לארץ כנען, מדרום לצפון הוא מהלך. And this journey that he's taking all along from Egypt to the land of Canaan is a northward journey. It's actually northeast, but it's northward. He's heading, Egypt is down to the southwest of where Israel is in the land of Canaan. And so Abram is going northeast in the other direction, upwards towards Israel to the area of the Negev, which itself is in the south of Israel. She'eretz Mitzrayim b'derama shel Eretz Yisrael, because the land of Egypt is to the south of the land of Israel, as is explained. Okay, so that's Rashi on verse 1, chapter 13. And now chapter 13, verse 2, it says, Avram kaved ma'od. Avram kaved. Well, the simple English translation is he was rich, but really kaved means heavy. Heavy. Kavod, kaved means heaviness. So Rashi says it means ta'un masa'ot, laden with burdens. So it could be interpreted in any number of ways. Vayelech lemasa'av, and then he went in chapter 13, verse 3 now. We're on verse 3. It says that Abram went, Vayelech lemasa'av, he went on his journeys, on the stages of his journey, Mi Negev ad Beisel. From the Negev to Beisel, he continued traveling northward, ad hamakom, till the place asher hayasham ehala betchila, to where his tent was originally, bein Beit El uvein ha'ai, between Beit El and Ai. That's going further north. It's basically what we call today in the West Bank. So it says he went on his journeys. What are these journeys? When he returned from Egypt, when he went from Egypt to the land of Canaan, he went, interesting, it's an interesting teaching, he stopped off in the same motels, in the same inns that he had stopped off before. Some of the commentaries say because he didn't pay them in full, so he wanted to pay them back. He didn't want to brag about his wealth, to be a show off. So he hid the fact that he was wealthy by borrowing money from the innkeepers, and now on his way back, he's paying them back. And it's teaching you a lesson, a moral lesson, that a person should sponsor the same places that he originally stayed at. You should try to sponsor. If you've got a set pattern of staying in certain places, you should sponsor. Now today, everything is corporate. You know, the hotels and motels, Hilton, and all these things. They're not owned by individuals. In the olden days, there weren't corporations. It wasn't a business that huge companies would own, and it's just totally impersonal. In the olden days, it was an individual, private, family business. You know, there would be families that would own inns and little places to stay. So if you have already stayed with them and sponsored them, you should, if you're traveling again through that place back or going through them again, you should continue sponsoring the same innkeepers. It's a kind of ethical guidance that's given. Fine, so that's verse 3. Rashi on chapter 13, verse 4. Yes, he called out to the name of God. Okay, I'm not going into that. 5. Now, coming to the subject of Lot. Just a word about Lot. Spoiler coming, okay? If you haven't heard, I'll tell you now. Eventually what's going to happen to Lot is he will move to Sodom, which is an evil city. It's going to be destroyed by God in a catastrophe, in a cataclysm. And pardon the ringing in the background. It's going to be destroyed in a cataclysm. And Lot will flee with his wife and 2 daughters. His wife will die because they were told not to look back, and Lot's wife looked back, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. That was the punishment she got. There's a reason for that. We'll get into it hopefully in the future. And Lot and his 2 daughters took refuge in a cave. And they thought that all of humanity had been destroyed. It looked to them, it appeared to them that the whole world had been destroyed. Certainly their world had been destroyed. So they got altruistic, and the daughters among themselves said, well, who's going to continue humanity? How will there still be a human race? So they came up with the scheme to make their father drunk. And one night, the oldest daughter slept with the father, with Lot, and a child was born, from which came the nation of Moab. And the other night, the next daughter slept with Lot, and another child was born that was known as the nation of Ammon, Moab and Ammon. Now, of course, this is an act of incest. But before the Torah was given, it's not clear exactly what the moral codes were. There must have been gray zones. But it seems even that was very unusual because they had to make their father drunk. So it seems there was a prevailing morality not to have sexual relations with your immediate relatives. That's one of the laws of morality. It's understood. Don't just have indiscriminate sex with your children and with your parents if you're a child. It's something that's looked askance upon. And later there will be actual laws, mitzvot in the Torah forbidding that, right? It's what we call incest. And it's something that's negative. It's looked down upon. So they committed incest with their father, and they both had babies. And this, they say, is all a result of Lot's living with the evil Sodomites, that he was these kind of socio-economic, immoral influences seeped into their worldview. So, but there is a redeeming motif there as well, that from the descendants of the 2 daughters will come women. Ruth comes from Moab, and a woman by the name of Naamah comes from Ammon, and Ruth becomes the ancestress of King David. She marries Boaz, who's one of the ancestors of King David, and Naamah marries Shlomo HaMelech, King David's son, Solomon, and they have a son, Jeroboam, who becomes a king of Judah. So they are the progenitors. They become progenitors of royalty. In other words, from this act of incest will eventually come the royal lines of the Jewish people, the Davidic line, the Messianic line. Now, why it's done that way, why God wants it to happen that way, there are reasons for that also. They say to hide it from the Satan, because if the Satan would have known exactly how the Messiah would be born, through normal, regular births, he would mess it up. So God has to hide it through these channels, these shady channels, and create a stream of genealogy that will result in the Davidic Messianic monarchy to evade the entrapments of the satanic forces. Okay, so that's basically a reason. So that's like a long-term view of this guy Lot. But now we're meeting him. All we knew till now is that he traveled with Abram. We'll be hearing more about him. And now it says, chapter 13, verse 5, V'gam leLot haholech et Avram hayatzon uvakar ve'ohalim. And also to Lot, who went with Abram, there was tzon flocks. Bakar, tzon means like sheep and goats. Bakar means like herds of cattle. Ve'ahalim, and tents. So let's see the Rashi on verse 5. Ha'alechet Avram, who went with Abram. So question, why was he going with Abram? What brought him to go along with Abram, with his uncle? So Rashi explains. He asks the question, Mi garam shehayat lozat, who caused that Lot had all this wealth? Halichato im Abram, because he got rich. Being with Abram, he got rich. So that's what caused him to tag along with his uncle. He saw that he won the lottery, that Abram was a lucky man, fortunate man, a blessed man, who was always gathering more and more flocks and possessions and wealth. So he stuck around with his uncle Abram and got rich. A get rich quick scheme. Okay. And I just wanted to stop on this little one. I'm sort of jumping the gun, that it says here that Lot had flocks and herds and tents. So there's no Rashi on the and tents, but I did find something in the Midrash Rabbah, which we hopefully will look at later, some points in the Midrash Rabbah that say, Midrash Rabbah on Parshat Lech Lecha, the portion of Lech Lecha, it says here, this is on Genesis chapter 13, verse 5, which is the verse we're looking at. He had flocks and herds and tents. So Rabbi Tobiah ben Rabbi Yitzchak said, what are these tents? What tents did he have? That's so important that the Torah has to mention he had tents. Okay, he had flocks and he had herds. That's wealth. Okay, good. But what's tents got to do with it? What does tents come to teach you? So this Midrash is answering that question in the name of Rabbi Tovia ben Rabbi Yitzchak, who said he had two tents meaning dynasties, namely Ruth the Moabitess and Nama the Ammonitess, which I just explained to you. Ruth came from Moab. She will eventually come from the union between Lot and his older daughter, and Ammon will come from the union between Lot and his younger daughter. Similarly, it is written, arise, take thy wife and thy two daughters that are found. That's in later a verse in Genesis 19. Rabbi Tobiah said that means two finds. The same thing. Finds means Ruth and Nama. Now there's a Nama, not mentioned in the Torah, but it's one of the names for Noah's wife. So it's a different Nama. It's a Hebrew name. There are still girls today who are given the name Nama. It comes from the word Naim. The word Naim, Naomi, Nama. And then Rabbi Isaac commented, there's a verse, I have found David, my servant. Where did I find him? In Sodom. So David was hiding in the sense that the precursor of David in the form of Lot and his daughter and his daughters, they are the precursors of David. So Lot, in fact, has a significance because he is Lot and his daughters are ancestors of the Jewish royal line, the Davidic dynasty, not Davidic. The line of King David's dynasty comes from Lot. So that's very important. And as you see, the Medrash learns that out from that word and his tents in Genesis chapter 13, verse 5. Okay, let's continue. So the land wasn't enough for the shepherds of Lot and Abram. And then there was an argument. I'll summarize it. There was an argument between the shepherds of Lot and the Shebbets of Abraham. So the Midrash in the Bereshis Rabbah, Rashi brings the Medrash, and the Midrashim talk about it. The other sources talk about it. Essentially, what was happening is Lot's shepherds would graze in the fields of the other people, the Jebusites and the Perizzites. There was two nations. Sorry, I'm taking your time. There were two nations. Anyhow, the two local nations that were over there. So the shepherds of Abram complained to the shepherds of Lot, why are you guys letting your animals graze in these fields that belong to these other people? And Abram's shepherds would keep their animals muzzled, whilst Lot's shepherds would keep the animals unmuzzled and just let them randomly go and eat in these other fields. So the Midrashim say that Lot's shepherds said, look, Abraham has no children, and he was promised this land. So Lot is his nephew. Lot is going to be his inheritor. He's going to inherit what belongs to Abraham. So therefore, ergo, thus, the fields belong to Lot as well, and there's no problem. But they pointed out, but in the meantime, Abraham still has not taken hold of the land because here it is. The Canaanite and the Perizzite was still in the land, meaning this is chapter 13, verse 7. It says the Canaanite and the Perizzite were still in the land. So far, it still belongs to these other guys. So you don't have a right yet. The green light has not yet been given to take over their lands, even though they themselves are not rightfully the owners because they took it from the children of Shem. So they themselves are squatters, so to speak, on the land. But it's not your turn yet to take the land. So you see already Lot, he's already turning, his shepherds and himself turning in the wrong direction. Okay? So Abram said, chapter 13, verse 8, Vayomer Avram el Lot. So Avram said to Lot, Al na tehi meriva beini uveinecha, uvein ra'ai, uvein ra'echa. Let there not be a quarrel between me and you, between my shepherds and your shepherds, because we're brothers. So now Rashi says on this verse, he comments on, what does this mean? We are brothers. So Rashi says, kroivim, because you would call a relative like a brother, a nephew is like a brother, brother, sister. You can sometimes refer to a close relative in that way. And the Medrash Agada says, Rashi, is domim beklas tapanim. They had similar features. They looked alike. There was some kind of similarity, which is significant, which shows you that they share a genetic pool. So Lot was, we're going to see, he's not such a good guy, but he's not necessarily such a bad guy either. He's one of these characters like Noah, who's in between. You know, he's with Abraham, but he has a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination, and tries to pull away from Abraham. And so they say, okay, if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. Whichever direction, Abraham gives him the choice of the better land, which is in the Jordan Valley. And that's what and that's what they did. That's how they separated. And Lot headed in the direction of Sodom. And that's what it says in chapter 13, verse 11. Vayivchar lo Lot et kol kikar hayarden. Lot chose for himself the plain, the Jordan plain, the Jordan Valley. It's very fertile over there. Even before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's near the Jordan River. It gets water, what's the word? Irrigated from the fresh waters that come down from the Sea of Galilee down towards the Dead Sea. And in those days, the Dead Sea was not dead yet, because that was as a result of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So it was a fertile area, and it still is. Vayipardu, Vayisa Lot Mikedem, and Lot traveled east, and Lot journeyed east. So it's an odd word, Mikedem, because Mikedem means from the east. He was going east, but the word in the Torah, the prefix ma, means from. So how is he traveling to the east if he's traveling from the east? So there's an interpretation, Mikedem, that's what's bothering Rashi. He says, Mikedem, nasa me'etzel Avram v'halach lo lema'arava shel Avram. So first of all, he went eastwards physically. He went from Abraham, who was in the east, and he went to the Vahalachlo Lemaravash So he went to the west of Abraham. He went to the west of Abraham. Nimtzam Nasir min Mizrach Lemarov. So he's going from east to west. So that's the translation here is a little problematic, because it says, and Lot journeyed east, that Rashi says he's traveling because the translation says he's traveling to the east, and Rashi says he's actually moving to the west. So it's the opposite of what the verse is saying. I want to see what Aryeh Kaplan says on chapter 13, verse 11. Chapter 13, verse 11. Abram lived in the land of Canaan. He headed eastward. You see? Aryeh Kaplan, it is confusing. He headed eastward. Aryeh Kaplan translates, he headed eastward, and the two separated. Abram lived in the land of Canaan. So let's see what the little note says. The verse literally says, from the east. But from the context, this must be interpreted as eastward, since the Jordan is to the east of Beth El. So in the context, it means he traveled eastward. He traveled from the east, he traveled eastward, but it was, according to Rashi, it was to the west of Abraham, so it becomes confusing. I'm sorry, we'll have to move on. But what I wanted to focus on is the interpretation of Mikedem, is that he moved away Mikedem, a deeper meaning, Mikadmoina shel olam, from the one who is the beginning of the world. In other words, Kadmon means the first. Who is the first? God. He moved away from God. He was moving away from religion. He was moving away from Abraham's religion of monotheism. And he was attracted to the surrounding idolatry and the evil ways of Sodom. Amar, and he said, Rashi gives us the thought process of Lot. I afshi, la be'avram ve'la be'lohav. It's impossible for me. I don't want either Avram nor his God. I don't want to have anything to do with them. So that's a serious matter. He's separating himself from Abram, from the righteous person, and he is also separating himself from God. So that's a drushic, an interpretive meaning for the word that Lot traveled Kedem, from Kedem. What is he traveling away from? He's traveling away from Abraham and from God. Now it says, verse 12, Avram yashav be'eretz Canaan ve'Lot yashav be'arei hakikar vayehal ad Sodom. So Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and moved his tents as far as Sodom. So Abram was to the west. Abraham settled himself to the west, and Lot settled himself to the east of Eretz Yisrael. Now, it says, now going into this story, we're getting into Sodom. The verse, the Torah says, the people of Sodom were Ra'im. Ra'im means bad. V'chata'im, they were sinners. Ladonai, to God, ma'od. So what are they doing? V'anshei Sodom Ra'im, says Rashi. V'afal pikein lo nimna Lot milishkon mimahem. And even so, Lot did not hold himself back from going to live with him. In other words, he knew they were bad. He knew that they were evil. He knew that they sinned, that they did no good. And yet, nevertheless, he still went to live among them. And our rabbis learned from here, it's in Talmud Yoma, Tractate Yoma. The Shem Reshem Yakav, there's an exclamation that when we talk about a righteous person, we say, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. May the memory of the righteous be a blessing. And about evil people, we say, Shem Reshem Yirkav. May the name of the wicked people rot. And it's derived from these people in Sodom. Exactly how it's derived, I don't have that in front of me. We would have to go and look up the Gemara, the Talmud in Yoma, and I don't have that here in front of me now. Ra'im, they were bad. What does it mean they were bad? But gufam, with their bodies. In other words, they did bodily bad things, physically. V'chata'im, and they sinned. So how are they bad and sinned? If they're bad, it means they sinned. If they sinned, it means they're bad. So what's the difference? Why is the Torah giving us two descriptions, two adjectives about who they were, about the subject? They were bad and they sinned. So they were ra'im begufam, with their bodies, they did bad things physically. V'chata'im b'mamonam, with their money. They did evil things with their money. There are descriptions in the Midrashim, and the Rashi quotes it also from Sanhedrin. It's in the Talmud. Now, the Talmud itself, the Gemara is divided. 1/7 of the Gemara is Agadata. Agadata means like midrashic, moralistic teachings, and the rest is things that have to do with halacha, the derivation of Jewish laws, the mitzvot. So now, why does it say in chapter 13, verse 13, that the people of Sodom were bad and they sinned? Ladonaimo, to God a lot. To God a lot. Well, of course, if they were bad and they sinned, to who else? I mean, God is the one who sets the standard of morality, right? And through giving man guidance, through moral guidance. First it was to Adam, then to the generations, and the generations that fell, and then it's now through Abraham. So how and why are they bad to God a lot? So Rashi says, Yodim Ribonam. They knew God. It's not as if they didn't know about God. They weren't just atheists. They weren't just ignoramuses. They weren't just idiots. They knew about God. They knew about the phenomenon of God. Umitkavnim limrod bo. But no, they were lahachisniks. If you've ever heard that expression, a lahachisnik means someone who does something bedafkaniks. They just wanted to spite God. They knew about God, and then they deliberately umitkavnim limrod bo. They wanted to be rebels against God. So now, chapter 13, verse 14. Vadonai Amar el Abram. Acharei hipared Lot me'imo. And God said to Abram after Lot separated, this is what hipared we're going to see. Sa na'einecha, raise up your eyes. Urei Min hamakom asher ata sham, and from you, take a look from the place. Tzafana v'negba v'kedma v'yama. Tzafana means north, negba south, kedma means to the east, yama means to the ocean, which is the west. In Israel, the ocean is at the west, the Mediterranean. It was also called Yam Hagadol, the great ocean. Ki et kol haaretz asher ata ro'eh lecha etnena. The entire land that you see, I'm going to give it to you and to your descendants ad olam, forever. V'samti et zar'acha kafar haaretz, and I will make your seed like the dust of the earth. Asher im yuchal limnot et afar haaretz gam zar'acha yimaneh. They will be like plentiful, like the dust of the earth. Kum hitchalech ba'aretz, arise, walk the land. Le'archa le'rafa, its length and breadth. Ki lecha etnena, to you I'll give it. God is really now talking to Abraham. Vayel Abram vayavo vayashav ba'alem mareh asher bechevron vayiven sham mizbech l'Adonai. So Abraham came to the place near Hebron and he built an altar. But all of this happens, going back now to chapter 13, verse 14, it says, Acharehi pared Lot, that God said to Abram after the separation from Lot. So Rashi says, what's the significance of saying after the separation of Lot? Kol zman sheharasha imo haya hadibur paresh mimenu. As long as the wicked one was with him, meaning Lot is considered the wicked one, so the divine spirit was separated from Abraham. So now once Lot is gone, God can now communicate with Abraham. And then he promises that your seed will be as plentiful as the dust of the earth. And this is not only talking about the Jewish people, because Abram is called Av Hamon Goyim, he's the father of many nations, and he marries Hagar and then Keturah. Some say Keturah is Hagar, and he sends her children to the east. And I've heard interpretations from rabbis that I studied with that the nations of the east, like the Indians and the Chinese, these multiple nations are in fact the descendants of Abraham. They have Abrahamic descent. They are of Abrahamic descent, and they are really plentiful. But others say no, it's only going on specifically on the Jewish people, and it's yet to be. How to understand why the Jewish people have always been so small is a problem. Now let's take a look. It says he parade. In this verse, he parade, I saw a commentary again in the Midrash that says, Medrash Rabbah, again, Medrash Rabbah, on Medrash Rabbah on chapter 13, verse 14, focusing on this word hipared, achared hipared. Now, there's different ways of saying hipared, of separating from someone. The translation is after, in English, it wouldn't make a difference. But there's a subtlety in Hebrew, because it says, Rabbi Yehuda said, there was anger in heaven against our father. One minute. Just 1 minute. Where did you get hiparade? Yeah. It says, separate thyself. This is on an earlier verse, but it's the same meaning. Verse. This is in Genesis chapter 13, verse 9. It says, "Halo kol haaretz lefanecha," the whole land is before you. Hipared na me'alai, separate from me. Hipared. And that same word is used, not hit parade, hipared. 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 And the same word is used in verse 14, achared hipared Lot, after Lot separated. So what is the meaning of this word hipared? Rabbi Chelba said, it does not say hibadel, because the correct, more polite way should have said hibadel, and havdalah is a separation. Lahavdil means to separate. Havdel means a difference, a separation, right? But preda means also a separation, but it's a rough in the rougher sense. Preda. It opens itself to an interpretation which I'll read to you. So it says hibadel is not written, but it's written as hipared. Why? Midrash, drush meaning interpretive meaning. Just as a pareda, a mule, cannot develop semen, so is it impossible for this man Lot to mix with the seed of Abraham. There's a donkey, there's a horse, and there's a mule. What's a mule? When a horse and a donkey mate, they produce a mule. A mule is a stronger animal, strong as a mule, because it has elements of the donkey and of the horse in it. You know, horses are not necessarily good beasts of burden. They're good for riding. They're good for schlepping. But you can't use them as a pack mule. That's what it's used, a pack mule, to pack stuff on their backs. And there's some places where you cannot take a carriage. You need to go on a mule. Like they say, for example, Napoleon, when he crossed the Alps from Austria to conquer Italy, there's a famous painting of him on a white horse, sort of like waving as he goes over the Alps, but they say it wasn't true. He rode on either a mule or a donkey because they're very sure-footed. When you're going through treacherous terrain, especially over mountains and in dangerous places where you cannot necessarily just load up a wagon, you pack it up on the pack mule. Donkeys are slow moving, but the mules are better because a mule is a donkey that's been bred. It's a hybrid, literally hybrid between a horse and a donkey, so you get a mule. But the downside of it is that mules cannot breed themselves because their semen is sterile, or the semen cannot develop. They cannot even develop semen. So it is impossible for this man Lot to mix with the seed of Abram. So that's a hint when it says hipared, like become like a mule. I don't want your people mixed with my people. Keep apart. And we'll see later in the Torah, the Moabites and the Ammonites are cursed. That for many generations, the Torah says a Moabite cannot enter the congregation of Israel because they were cruel to the children of Israel. Now there's a question talking about on verse chapter 13, verse 14, that God starts to speak to him after he separated from Lot. So there's now a question, still continuing with Midrash, another observation from the Midrash on chapter 13, verse 14, when it says that God speaks to Abram after Abram, he separated from Lot. So the Midrash says, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, there was anger in heaven against our father Abraham when his nephew Lot parted from him. Anger against Abram. Now, it's not directly in the text. It's a drush. an interpretive meaning, and it shows you that there was a little bit of a tumult. Tumult is a Yiddish word for a little bit of a hubbub up there in Shamayim, in heaven, actual anger even against our father Abraham when his nephew Lot parted from him. God said, he makes everyone cleave to me. He's like Makarev, he like brings people closer to God all the time, all over the place, said the Holy One, blessed be he, yet he does not cause his brother's son to cleave to me. What's going on? Why doesn't Abraham, who's famous for gathering people? Remember in chapter 11, we read Maimonides' description, how Abraham would go from town to town and city to city and even nation to nation and preach about God and bring people closer, and people would ask him questions. So, well, if he's such a master of outreach from monotheism, why doesn't he do this for his nephew Lot? Why is he so happy and pushes Lot away? Right? Good question. So there is an answer. Rabbi Nehemiah said there was anger in heaven against the patriarch Abraham when Lot, his brother's son, went with him. That no, you got to like go a few steps earlier. When Lot went with Abraham, there was actually anger in heaven that Abraham let Lot come with him, because in the very first place, when Abraham started his journey, he was separating himself from the evil people in Ur Kasdim. And in fact, the verse is, Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladecha mibeit avicha. Go from your land, from your birthplace, and from the house of your father. Leave your family, leave your country, leave your kinsmen, your countrymen, leave everyone, and go to the land that I will show you. So why did he take Lot? That's his father's house. Lot was his nephew, his father's brother's son, Haran's son, right? So in a sense, Abraham did something that he wasn't supposed to do by taking Lot. This is what Rabbi Nehemiah points out. Said God, yet he attaches Lot to himself. If so, let him go and procure 2 common soldiers. So it's coming back to this text. I think it's a hint. If so then there will be a purpose for Lot, because from him will come out the Davidic royal line in a mysterious fashion. So that's that. There is something else in this medrash that no, it was in another one. So that's it for the Medrash Rabbah. I have in my possession a book. It's called Sana Arena, put out by Art Scroll. This was a book that was originally written in Old Yiddish and was used for the home education of Jewish women in Europe. And it's like a compendium of midrashic and Aggadic interpretations, things that are important to know based on the weekly Torah portion. So women would read this, and a lot of them knew this book by heart. It's called Sena Rena, Go Out and See. It's based on a verse from the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. So Lot leaves Abram and Sodom sins. I wanted to read to you a little bit about that. It said Lot journeyed east. That we saw that, chapter 13, verse 11. Journeyed away from God. We saw that. Who is called Kadmon Shel Olam, the first in the world, alluding to the resemblance between the words Kadmon and Kedem, eastward. Lot said, I reject Abram and his God and move towards Sodom and Amorah. These were cities inhabited by wicked people who committed evil with their bodies and with their possessions. These were the men whom Lot chose to be his fellows. And so then we saw this also. When the verse mentions Sodom and Amorah, it immediately speaks of their evil. The sages learned from this that when speaking of a wicked person, one should speak ill of them. In the words of the verse, V'shem Rishem Yirka, we saw that also. The name of the wicked ones shall perish. It's also from Mishlei, Proverbs. you see that God, when speaking about Sodom, he didn't mince his words. He said they were wicked and sinners. So this teaches you that when you speak about an evil person, you should right away say something negative about them. Shouldn't leave it at that. There's also an expression, Yamach Shema. So let's say you speak about Hitler, you say Yamach Shema. May his soul be blotted out. Or Shem Rishaim Yirkav. May the names of the evil people be rot. Now, the Gemara writes in Tractate Sanhedrin, Perek Chelek, that the people of the tractate is a section of the Talmud, that the people of Sodom became evil because God gave them enormous quantities of food, gold, and silver. So they became evil because they were spoiled by materialism. Materialism ruins people. You know, our ancestors in Europe and the Middle East who were poorer were generally more God-fearing. Poorer people have a greater sense of God and godliness and faith. They said, so they became wealthy, and we see that it says they sinned we saw that in a verse, that the Sodomites sinned with their bodies and with their wealth. So now was an example of how they sinned with their wealth. They said, we will close our land to guests who come only to steal away our treasure. So they didn't want guests. Their judges ruled unjustly. A person, it's called Hilchas Daim. It's an upside-down, topsy-turvy world. A person traveling over a bridge had to pay a toll of 4 coins. A person traveling on the water near the bridge was forced to pay 8 coins. So the bridge, you should be paying more because it's easier for you. No, so they had a topsy-turvy system. If you're going over the bridge, you pay 4 coins. And let's say you can't afford to pay to go over the bridge and you want to wade through the water because you absolutely have to get to the other side. So they punish you. They make a fine. You have to pay double, 8 coins. Now, another case. If someone beat another man's wife and caused her to miscarry, the judges ruled that he must make her again pregnant. Is that a crazy system? You caused a woman to have a miscarriage, so you have to make her pregnant again. It's a crazy system. Sounds crazy, but some countries have crazy systems. If a person beat another so badly that blood flowed out of his wounds, the judges held that the one who was beaten had to pay his tormentor because he had let the blood, as the doctors of those times used to do. They used to do bloodletting, right? That was a way they practiced medicine, to let out blood, that they believed it got rid of negative stuff inside of you. So if you threw something at someone and you caused the wound, and it started bleeding, you had to, he had to pay his tormentor because he had let his blood. The one who was beaten had to pay his tormentor because he got his blood. So you're not only don't you get damages for being beaten up, but you have to pay because this other guy caused your bloods to run. And it brings a story here that Abram's servant Eliezer, Abram had a servant Eliezer, once came to Sodom. He was beaten until his blood ran, and he took his attackers to court. The judge ruled that he should pay his attackers because they had done him a medical service by bleeding him. So Eliezer wasn't stupid. He took a stone and hurled it at the judge, who started to bleed profusely. He then told the judge, pay me for your treatment, and then I will pay my attackers. So they were really rotten to the core. And this is a famous one. The Sodomites had a bed for guests. If the guest was tall, they would chop off his feet until he would fit the bed. If he was short, they stretched him until he was as long as the bed. They told Eliezer to lie down. He answered them, from the day that his mistress Sarah died, he had vowed never to lie down on a bed. Okay, this is jumping the gun a little bit, but that's it. If a person was tall, they would chop off his feet to fit into the bed. If a person was short, they would stretch him out. When a poor person, a beggar, would come to beg, the inhabitants of Sodom would give him no bread. Instead, each person gave him a coin with his own name engraved on it. When the beggar died of hunger, each one would come and retrieve his own coin. So they had a crazy system. They would give charity with their own initials engraved on it. And when the beggar would die, they would go and take back their money. Crazy society. And then there's a story about a girl who once gave a beggar in secret a piece of bread. They found her to be guilty of harboring, being friendly to beggars. What they did was they smeared her with honey, put her on the roof so that the bees would sting her to death. And that's when her cries reached God. He said in the heavenly court, let's see what's doing down there, that the scream of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. And that's the scream. This screaming refers to the young girl, for the word Rabbi, great, is similar to the word Riva, young girl. Okay. So that's from the Tzena Urena, put out by Art Scroll. I read you that. Also, it contains extracts from the Talmud, from Midrashim. And finally, I just want to see one or two little extracts from the Zohar. Don't get, that's the back of it. This is the front of it. Don't get nervous. Just a couple of little interesting extracts. Yes, well, it says, it repeats that you can see the theme running through Rashi, the Tzena Urena, and here it is. I want to read it to you in triplicate, so you'll see that how the sources are all focused in the one way. They have the right hashkafa. Hashkafa means the right outlook, the right psychology in looking at a verse. Rashi mentions it, Tzena Urena mentions it, and here the Zohar mentions it. That Lot actually did revert to idolatry, we know from the word, and Lot journeyed from the east. Mikedem, again, from that Mikedem. The word Mikedem from the east is equivalent to Mikadmono, from the ancient one of the world. Similarly, it says of the men who built the Tower of Babel that they journeyed from the east. So you see, it says that Lot traveled away from God. He moved away from God. So this theme is repeated in the Zohar and in the other sources. And as soon as Abram saw that this was what was in Lot's mind, he separated himself, as if to say, you're not worthy to associate with me. So Abram separated from him and refused to accompany or join him, since whoever associates with a sinner eventually follows in his footsteps and so brings punishment upon himself. Right? So don't hang out with bad people. As my mother used to say in the name of her mother, show me your friends and I'll tell you who you are. You can tell a person by what company he keeps. It's an English expression, right? So if you hang out with bad people, you might not be bad at the time, but you'll become bad. If you hang out with good people, you might not be that good at the outset, but you'll become good hanging out with the good people. And then it talks about the land of Israel separating from the land of Israel, because Abraham came to the land of Israel, and the Shekhinah and God speaks to Abraham. Once Lot separates from Abraham, God speaks to him. Good things happen to the Jewish people in Israel. So the Zohar talks about when Israel were in their own land, everything was as it should be. The heavenly throne was fully spread over them. The throne of God. And the liturgy which they performed pierced through the ether and ascended on high to its place. The avoda they did in the Beis HaMikdash and the prayers they uttered went in the right direction up on high. For Israel alone was qualified to serve God in that land, says the Zohar. And therefore the Gentiles kept aloof. They kept out, since they did not rule over it as now, but were nourished only by the residue, by the klipa. There's a residue. So the Gentiles stayed out of it. As long as the Jews were on the right track, on the right derech, the children of Israel, and they did not sin, so then their prayers and their service went up to God, and the Gentiles kept away. Now you may say, question, how do you reconcile this with the fact that a number of foreign kings ruled over it at the time when the temple still existed. Yes, when the temple still existed, foreign kings came, especially in the times of the Second Temple, the Greeks and the Romans came. The answer is that in the time of the First Temple, before Israel defiled the land, the Gentiles did not rule over it, but were nourished from the residue, from the klipa. But when Israel sinned and defiled the land, it was only once Israel sinned and defiled the land, meaning behaving negatively, they, as it were, drove the Shekhinah from its place. Important principle. When Jews sin, they chase away the divine presence, and it went to another place, and therefore other nations were allowed to rule over the land. So it's not might that and warfare that got the other nations into the land of Israel and to rule over them. It was when they sinned, when they served idols, when they committed murder, when they did sexual immorality. For no angel has control of the land of Israel, but only God. That's a very important principle. That people worry about Israel, what will be, blah, blah, blah. This president, that president, the Arabs, the Iranians, back and forth. No, you have to know, like the Zohar says, no angel has control of the land of Israel, but only God. God. So don't worry if there's something happening, even if the Jewish people are driven out, it's for a reason. It's God. Israel is God's personal domain. He's under his direct supervision. When Israel sinned and burned incense to other gods in the Holy Land, the Shekhinah was driven from its place. God's presence was driven from its place. And other gods were associated with it. And so other nations obtained dominion and the prophets died out, right? So you see that after this, we're talking about after Abraham, that the Zohar is discussing what happened when the people went downhill. Instead of following in the ways of Abraham, they followed in the ways of the Sodomites. So, and the prophets died out, and all the higher grades ceased to rule, and dominion was not withdrawn from other nations because they drew the Shekhinah to themselves. Yeah, because they worship, they have merits, there's the principle of Keshazeh comes Zenofel. When one falls, the other rises. So when the Jews fall, their enemies rise. We'll go into that in future chapters. Hence, in the time of the Second Temple, the rule of the other nations did not cease, and even less so in the period of the exile. Now, the Zohar is going to the time of the exile, when the Shekhinah found herself among other nations, where other chieftains exercised dominion, deriving their sustenance from the Shekhinah, which has consorted with them. Thus we see that Israel dwelt in their own land. Thus we see that when Israel dwelt in their own land and maintained the temple service, the Shekhinah remained among them in privacy and did not issue from her house openly. Therefore, all the prophets who lived in those times drew their inspiration only from her place, as we have said. That was the reason why Jonah fled from the Holy Land, namely that the prophetic inspiration should not come to him and he should not have to take the Lord's message. Okay? So getting into the subject of Jonah, I don't want to do that. And so that's a message from the Zohar, that you see that how important and central the land of Israel is now that we have, it's on all levels. Abraham returning to the source, the land of Israel now going towards what it's supposed to be used for, a homeland for Abraham, for the service of God. That's why he builds altars to worship God. And this will subsequently be the Maaseh Avos Siman Labanim, the sign of the forefathers will be for the sons. The children of Israel will come to Israel to worship the land of Israel. Then there will be exiles because they worshipped idols, because they committed murder, because they did sexual immorality. That was the first temple sins. The second temple sins, sinat chinam, causeless hatred, unnecessary hatred of people, they hated each other. And then finally we see a geula again, a final ingathering of the exiles as we have it in our days, in our times, as we see more and more Israel being rebuilt, Jews being ingathered, Torah growing, more and more observance of Judaism, of Torah, and doing of mitzvot. And hopefully with the coming of the Mashiach, we will have the third Beit HaMikdash, the third temple, and then all the earth will return to being as it was in the times before Adam and Eve sinned, and we'll have the true tikkun olam, the true perfection of the world, of peace on earth and brotherhood and all the good things that await us in the future. So thank you very much for listening, and we will return soon. My email is rudomin@jpi.org and rudomin@att.net if you need to reach me. Thank you so much.